In the beginning, there was one atom bomb. It was 1945.
Having found the atomic bomb, we have used it. It is an awful responsibility which has come to us. We thank God that it has come to us, instead of to our enemies.
By 1952, the Americans had 1,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviets, about 100.
Now, in any combat where these things can be used on strictly military targets and for strictly military purposes, I see no reason that they shouldn't be used just exactly as you'd use a bullet or anything else.
8 years later, the superpower arsenal exceeded 20,000.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response from the Soviet Union.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the superpowers had more than 30,000 nuclear weapons.
The Chinese Communist nuclear detonation is a reflection of policies which do not serve the cause of peace. But there is no reason to fear that it will lead to immediate dangers of war.
By the end of the 1960s, England, France, and China had acquired nuclear weapons.
Two nuclear nations, each of which has the power to destroy humanity, have no alternative but to coexist peacefully. Because in a nuclear war, there would be no winners.
By 1974, the superpower arsenal had risen to 52,000.
The Soviet Union and the United States have accumulated thousands of nuclear weapons. Our two nations now have 5 times more missile warheads than we had just 8 years ago. But we are not 5 times more secure.
By 1980, the total was 55,000.
Today, the threat of nuclear disaster hangs over the lives of all our people. The Bible tells us there will be a time for peace, but so far this century, mankind has failed to find it.
Instead, we try to find security by staying ready for war. Radars dot our borders, and early warning satellites fill the skies. All of it because today, the United States and the Soviet Union could annihilate each other in less than an hour's time.
We have an IRBM in the system, and our confidence is high.
And so the militaries are on constant alert,
Missile warning
listening,
informed, sir. Thank you.
watching, and monitoring each other. Even after recent cuts, the superpowers have at their disposal some 50,000 nuclear weapons. These weapons are poised on the tips of intercontinental missiles underground, 28 minutes from their targets on the other side of the Earth. They ride in the holds of long and short-range bombers stationed at air bases around the world. Wherever the superpower navies cruise, nuclear weapons go with them. They prowl the depths on submarines, undetected, sometimes within minutes of impact on coastal cities. All the while, listening, watching, waiting. Ready for that day when, in spite of everything, in spite of all reason, deterrence fails.
Missile warning, this is Beale. Stand by for confidence reporting.
SSCO, no malfunction.
Missile warning, no malfunction.
got 32 targets in track and 10 impacting points. I want to confirm, is this an exercise? Roger, copy. This is not an exercise.
I gotta go.
Stand by to copy the message. Standing by.
50,000 nuclear weapons. Some 2.5 tons of TNT for every man, woman, and child on the planet. A 1 megaton hydrogen bomb exploding in the air above a single city would be an unimaginable catastrophe. The intense thermonuclear flash would ignite everything it touched over a distance of 8 miles. The shockwave would explode most buildings. Raging superheated winds of hurricane force would whip fire and debris through the air. No one knows how many such bombs would be detonated in a nuclear war, or if a war could be kept limited once it began. Our two countries rely on the terror of nuclear war to help us keep the peace. We've come to this precarious condition over the last 50 years of the nuclear age. This was the beginning. In the fall of 1933, a ship bearing Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov steamed into New York Harbor. Diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia were being reinstated for the first time since the Communist Revolution of 1917.
Enough. Are you glad to be in America?
I am delighted to be in America.
Oh, my. Listen,
yes, yes, I'm glad, yes. Yes, very glad, very glad.
Right here.
I'm delighted.
The two nations which would become the main antagonists in the nuclear age were reaching out to each other despite their profound ideological differences.
President Roosevelt, speaking at the Savannah, Georgia bicentennial, summarizes the meaning of the Russian-American agreement.
And I believe sincerely that the most impelling motive that has lain behind the conversations which were successfully concluded yesterday between Russia and the United States was the desire of both countries for peace, the desire for the strengthening of the peaceful purpose of the civilized world.
The United States and the Soviet Union were drawn together in part by a common fear: rising militarism around the globe. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and the Fascisti seemed bent on recreating the Roman Empire. In Japan, the emperor and his warlords were determined to control the Pacific region and expel all Western influence. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party preached the twin doctrines of expansionism and racial hatred.
Das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende.
Jewish intellectuals fled Nazi persecution. Albert Einstein, the brilliant physicist and pacifist who had ironically become linked to the development of the atomic bomb, emigrated to the United States in 1933. Dozens of outstanding European atomic physicists followed his lead. In the midst of this political upheaval, scientists were making great progress in the field of atomic physics. They were on the verge of discoveries that would excite the world of science and transform the world of politics.
It was really from the scientific point of view, an extremely exciting time. I mean, suddenly
we began to understand the structure of atoms and the structure of matter, which was completely unknown before, and there are new theories, new ideas, which are very different from the old ideas. It was a revolution in science. And so it's very exciting for everybody. But let me add, you know, it was very esoteric. We did not think at all that this business will have any direct connection with politics or with humanity, with the life of humanity.
But early in 1939, Danish physicist Niels Bohr brought news that would profoundly change the life of humanity. In Nazi-controlled Berlin, 2 German scientists had split the nucleus of a uranium atom by bombarding it with neutrons. The nucleus had been thought to be impenetrable, held together by extremely strong forces. But if it could be split in 2, this powerful binding energy would be released, and the world would never be the same.
During the process of fission, 2 neutrons, or approximately 2 extra neutrons, were emitted. And it became very clear that it might be possible, by utilizing, let's say, one of these neutrons to cause another fission, get another 2 neutrons, and so on, that you could build up the process so as to release a very large amount of energy, starting out with just 1 single neutron.
If you could make it go, you could convert this energy into power and make power reactors. And if you were able to make the chain reaction go very quickly, then you would get an explosion.
And then it was clear to us that this is a potential weapon.
In the same year that German scientists split the atom, German armies marched into Austria and part of Czechoslovakia. Trying desperately to avoid a global war, Prime Minister Chamberlain of Great Britain signed an agreement with Hitler, allowing the Nazi takeover of Czechoslovakia to go unchallenged.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
But Chamberlain's agreement with Hitler was, in fact, a prelude to World War. The fear of such an appeasement of an aggressor would come to haunt all international negotiations in the nuclear age. And in that fateful fall of 1938, Chamberlain's avoidance of confrontation allowed the Nazis to grow stronger and more confident. The Soviets, like the British, tried to avoid war with Germany. Fearful of attack from the West, they signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis in August 1939. Russia's alignment with Hitler fueled the ever-present distrust of communism in the United States.
The alignment between Nazi Bolshevism and Soviet fascism is just what the world should have expected. Both are ruthless dictatorships founded on hatred and maintained by force and fear.
The United States wanted nothing to do with the conflict in Europe. But as most Americans went about their business, concern with Hitler's increasing might consumed atomic physicist Leo Szilard, a refugee from Hungary. Szilard was convinced that physicists in Nazi Germany would attempt to build an atomic bomb. Albert Einstein lent his prestigious name to a letter which Szilard wrote to President Roosevelt. He outlined the theory of an atomic bomb and pointed out that Germany was already hoarding uranium, perhaps because the son of a high-ranking Nazi official was the prominent physicist Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker.
In the letter of Einstein to President Roosevelt, my name is mentioned. And it is mentioned because Szilard knew me, or he knew my name. He didn't know me personally. And my father was a high-ranking diplomat. He was in the German Foreign Office at that time. And it looked quite plausible that if I told my father we can make a bomb, my father might have told Hitler, and Hitler would have said, well, just go on, do it.
On September 1st, 1939, only 9 months after the discovery of fission in Berlin, the Nazis invaded Poland in a massive assault. Appeasement had failed. World War II had begun. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Then, 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, as they had secretly agreed in their pact with the Nazis. The United States tried to remain neutral.
I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will. And I give you assurance and reassurance that every effort of your government will be directed toward that end.
To be on the safe side, Roosevelt had appointed a secret committee to look into the military potential of uranium fission. Before they reached any conclusions, 2 physicists at Birmingham University in Britain came up with a new idea. They theorized that a bomb might be made using a relatively small quantity of an extremely rare isotope of uranium called U-235. Physicist Rudolf Peierls concluded that by using this isotope, bombs might be made small enough to be delivered by airplane.
We wrote a memorandum and sent it to the appropriate authorities. And apart from making the technical case for believing our conclusions, we also said in this memorandum that owing to the spreading of radioactive substances with the wind, the bomb could probably not be used without killing large numbers of civilians. And this may make it unsuitable as a weapon for use by this country, meaning Great Britain. We pointed out, however, that it was still essential to have it as a deterrent against Hitler's Germany maybe having this weapon.
The Soviets, too, were exploring the military potential of uranium. Research was being pursued by physicists such as Igor Kurchatov and Pyotr Kapitsa.
In those days, it was recognized that there is a possibility of using the nuclear energy for military purposes, for power. In very general terms, the Soviet government was alerted by Soviet scientists on these matters.
June 22nd, 1941. Soviet uranium research was abruptly halted when the Nazis suddenly attacked Russia. Emboldened by his lightning conquest of much of Europe, Hitler ignored his pact with Stalin and turned on the Soviet Union. Stalin was badly shaken. His attempt to avoid war with Germany had failed. He broadcast a dramatic appeal to the Soviet people to unite in defense of the motherland.
Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, the treacherous military attack of Hitlerite Germany continues.
Stalin tried to rally a nation ravaged by his own bloody purges. Even the Soviet physicists were put to work as part of a desperate defense effort.
In the Soviet Union, in the initial years of the war, the main point was to fight the Germans with ordinary means, and the resources that we had, the scientific resources, were used for other purposes. In fact, Alexandrov and Kurchatov, they were more in charge of demagnetizing ships rather than pursuing nuclear physics.
The surprise invasion left deep and lasting scars on the Soviet Union. The brutal and bloody Nazi advance across Russia's western border would serve to stiffen Soviet resolve to control Eastern Europe at war's end. This would become a constant source of tension between East and West in the nuclear age. But in the summer of 1941, France, Holland, and Belgium were under Nazi occupation. The Western Allies pushed aside their distrust of the Soviets in the face of the German threat.
Churchill, being the man he was, who took big decisions, I think within less than 24 hours, he'd gone on the air with a great speech welcoming the Russians as the victims of Nazi aggression. I mean, that's how he put it, and as our allies in the war against Hitler. Of course, he said privately, I think, that if Hitler invaded hell, he wouldn't mind having the devil as an ally.
Churchill was also courting the United States for increased aid in the war effort. Roosevelt, under great domestic pressure to stay out of the war, had maneuvered the United States into becoming the arsenal of democracy, sending Britain all manner of war supplies.
TNT from Tennessee, one of the most powerful high explosives known. Boxes and boxes of it, destined to fill the bombs and shells with which to smash that dictator and all his works. Tommy guns from Trenton, cannon from Connecticut, and bombs from Boston. Great big, beautiful bombs for hitting Hitler where it hurts most.
Britain and the United States also began to share results of uranium fission research. British scientists had convinced both governments that an atomic bomb was buildable within 2 to 4 years. The two countries pledged cooperation in the desperate race with Germany.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The trauma of surprise attack would continue to haunt the United States from that day forward. In the nuclear age, such a bolt from the blue could destroy an entire nation. Pearl Harbor became a symbol of vulnerability, and the U.S. commitment to stay out of the war lay dead at the bottom of the Pacific. The United States began to mobilize its forces, and outside the public eye, the race to develop an atomic weapon intensified. Roosevelt put the bomb effort, codenamed the Manhattan Project, into the hands of the Army. The general who supervised the building of the Pentagon, Leslie Groves, took charge. He appointed the brilliant young physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer to head the scientific team. Many of the best scientists in the country were secretly recruited to work on the project. One of them was physicist Philip Morrison.
One of my friends said, "You must come see me tomorrow. I must talk to you. Don't fail." And I said, "Okay, I'll do that." I knew what he wanted, more or less, but not precisely. So I came to his office behind a guarded door, and he said, "You know what we're doing here?" And I said, "Well, of course I have a general idea." He said, "Well, you probably don't realize we're after bombs." That was the word he said. Bombs. I said, "That's further than I thought." "Yes," he said, "it is much closer than you think. This is the most important thing that a physicist can do. You really ought to come join us. We need you." And I said, "Give me a few days to think about it," and I went home and I thought about it, and a few weeks later I was in Chicago.
In Chicago, at the university's metallurgical laboratory, the world's first nuclear reactor was built under the direction of Italian refugee physicist Enrico Fermi. The theory that each atomic fission of uranium would lead to another, resulting in a chain reaction, was about to be tested. On December 2nd, 1942, Fermi was ready. Physicist Bernard Feld watched as the cadmium rods used to control the reaction were withdrawn.
But when everything was ready, Fermi had the rods withdrawn one by one, and he was sitting there looking at the counter as the counter started to go up and up. And finally, when all the rods were withdrawn, one could hear the counter go and off scale. And Fermi said, "Well, I guess that's enough. Put the rods back and let's go to lunch."
The war still prevented Soviet scientists from making progress in their work. But a young physicist on leave from his post in the artillery, G.N. Flerov, accidentally uncovered evidence of the secret American bomb project.
When he started reading the current editions of the Physical Review, the magazine where all this research is published, he suddenly noticed that from a certain time all research on this subject had been cut off. And for him, who was thinking about these things, who had a very alert mind, who was a highly professional scientist in this field, it was his field, he immediately understood that it had been cut off simply because it had become too hot and too important. But the abruptness with which everything had been stopped was a sure pointer to him that the whole field was considered to be highly sensitive. And he sat down and wrote a letter to Stalin to that end.
Stalin also had reports of the American bomb project from Soviet intelligence. In spite of the critical war situation, he set up a small-scale bomb project in early 1943. As atomic scientists worked to make a bomb, the world was becoming a ready proving ground for their new weapon. With more and better aircraft and ever larger bombs, Axis and Allies alike carried out massive strategic bombing raids to destroy the enemy's industry and sources of supply, and gradually wear down the will of the people to continue the fight. This war was not fought only by armies in distant battlefields and navies in mid-ocean. This was total war. Civilians in their cities were seen as legitimate targets. Londoners quickly learned to live with the nightly air raids. Sir Frank Roberts recalls surveying the damage with his wife after the first Nazi bombing in the fall of 1940.
There was a big church there. It's the big Scottish church, St. Columba's, and it had been hit. For the first time, she'd seen anything in London. And there was a policeman standing there. And my wife said, rather stupid as one does, "Officer, what's happened?" And he's a great tall chap, and my wife's very small, and he looked down at her and said, "Mice, madam."
The intensity of strategic bombing increased throughout the war. The Nazis bombed London and Rotterdam, killing 90,000 civilians. The Allies bombed Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden. 70,000 died in Dresden alone. The world was becoming numb to mass destruction. In the Soviet Union, the Red Army battled back from early defeats, which left 300,000 dead in the first few months of fighting, and the Soviet capital in a state of siege. Now, Soviet armies were advancing, but the human cost was staggering. Stalin urged his allies to open a second front in Europe to take the pressure off the Red Army. But Britain had its hands full at home, and American forces were heavily engaged in the Pacific. For nearly 2 years, the Soviets bore the brunt of the combat in Europe. Stalin grew suspicious of Anglo-American motives, while the West heaped praise on its unlikely ally.
We believe in the Russian army. We believe in the skill of the Russian generals. We believe in the equipment of the Russian divisions. And we believe in Stalin's leadership. Yes, in Stalin's leadership.
The Soviet Union have no idea and no wish to interfere with the internal affairs of any other country. I know that from the lips of Stalin himself.
The Americans also promoted their wartime alliance with the Soviets. Ludmila Pavlichenko, a top sniper with the Russian forces, spoke to enthusiastic crowds across the United States in 1942.
Hello, soldiers, forward to victory.
She was celebrated. She was lionized. There was no restraining the admiration and the relief and the satisfaction that the American people felt at having the Russians, the Soviet Union, the Russians, on our side at last.
The alliance with the Russians did not extend to the atomic bomb project. After the successful chain reaction in Chicago, a small group of scientists and engineers was secretly assembled in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to begin construction of an atomic weapon under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer. The Army Corps of Engineers built a self-contained city in the desert. The work progressed rapidly, propelled by an ever-present fear that German physicists might be ahead in the race to the bomb.
We worked around the clock 6 days a week and Sundays too, because we felt we were the bottleneck in the manufacture of a weapon which we didn't make first would lead to the loss of the war. And every day we read of the battles in which our friends and colleagues and students and allies were being killed in droves. And here we were, in very pleasant circumstances, living in the mountains, working on physics in a wonderful community, and our job was to try to make a bomb. And if we didn't try our hardest, we were certainly remiss. And we did try very hard.
The technical problems were enormous. Uranium-235 is less than 1% of natural uranium and had to be painstakingly separated out in a giant plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Simultaneously, in Hanford, Washington, a man-made alternative to uranium-235, plutonium, was being produced. As the theories of atomic bombs moved from the blackboard and the laboratory toward an actual test, its potential impact on mankind became the passion of Niels Bohr. During visits to Los Alamos, Bohr often spoke to fellow scientists of his hopes for a better world in the nuclear age.
He said, maybe when this terrible, destructive weapon exists and people are aware of it, they will see that war is no solution. But he said, this can only be done if this new idea is not in the possession of one nation, for example, of the United States. It must be internationalized.
Bohr proposed including the Soviet Union in the Anglo-American Atomic Alliance as a first step toward internationalizing atomic power. He brought these ideas to both Roosevelt and Churchill, but they were too distrustful of the Russians to heed Bohr's advice. They signed a secret agreement not to share atomic bomb knowledge with other countries and to treat Niels Bohr as a potential threat to security. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Western Offensive, long awaited by Stalin, began with a bloody battle on the beaches of Normandy.
All our hearts and eyes were on the coast of France, where the US and British troops were finally confronting the German army in full scale. And with it, there came against London, especially, the V-1 cruise missile and the V-2 ballistic missile. We knew the Germans had been developing for some time. And it always seemed to me that those devices made very little sense unless they had nuclear warheads. So we felt that their use was preliminary to the first few nuclear warheads bursting in London. In those days, I was so concerned that I listened every day to the BBC on shortwave, not because I so much wanted to hear the news, but because I was anxious to see that London was still existing. I felt someday I would turn on the London frequency, would not be there because half a dozen or 10 nuclear warheads had burst in London. That was not to happen.
We knew around the end of 1940 that we could not possibly make it. The Americans did not know that we knew, and they did not know that it was so hard because they could imagine that we might have found an easier way than the Americans had found. And if I'm rightly informed, I think it only dawned slowly to our American colleagues that it was so difficult that the expectation that the Germans would have been able to make it during the war with under the conditions of air raids and all the other difficulties, that this was very improbable.
By August 22nd, Paris was free. As Germany's ultimate defeat looked more certain, the Allies focused on preserving their security at war's end. When the Big Three met at Yalta in February 1945, secret atomic bomb programs were underway in both the Soviet Union and the United States. But Stalin and Roosevelt kept their atomic secrets to themselves, revealing nothing of their scientists' work. The Yalta talks dealt instead with the shape of post-war Europe and the war still raging in the Pacific. Roosevelt secured a promise from Stalin to join the fight against the Japanese, and Stalin renewed his demands to maintain Soviet control over Eastern Europe.
The settlement in Eastern Europe was the major issue for Stalin and also for Churchill. But of course, Roosevelt wasn't so interested in that. He told Stalin that he intended to take the American troops out of Europe within a year or two after the end of the war, which meant that Stalin was going to be left with far and away the biggest army in a completely devastated continent. And they had this theory that if only you treat Uncle Joe like a member of the club, you see, one of us, he will eventually behave like a member of the club. And this, of course, was a great mistake, because Uncle Joe had his own communist club, in which he was the boss, and had no particular desire to join our Western club as a country member.
Across from the White House in Lafayette Park, the men, women, and children whom Franklin Roosevelt served so well watch in tearful silence.
Less than 2 months after the Yalta meetings, Roosevelt was dead. The personal ties he had nurtured with Stalin and Churchill died with him. Dead, too, was Roosevelt's intimate knowledge of the course of atomic bomb development. His thoughts about how the bomb might be used during the war and its effect on the post-war world were never shared with his vice president, Harry Truman. A few hours after he was sworn in, Truman was briefed on the bomb by Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Stimson told Truman that the Manhattan Project would produce a new explosive of almost unbelievable power. But the war in Europe was drawing to a close without the use of that new explosive. In April, Soviet troops advancing from the east met Americans from the west at the Elbe River in Germany. Their alliance of convenience had brought victory. They drank champagne together and danced beneath portraits of Stalin and Roosevelt. For a moment in time, the two nations that would become enemies after the war could celebrate their wartime triumph. By May of 1945, the Nazi threat, which had precipitated the frantic race to build an atom bomb, was finally crushed. The war in Europe was over.
This is Radio Moscow. The Soviet nation proclaims the 9th of May Victory Day.
It was the day we never forget, you know. We have a song. It was a day of joy and tears because of the victims of the war, of course. This was just a terrible war for our country. You see, a great part of European Russia was in ruins. We had 20 million dead, millions. It was a terrible war. Americans were happy and not to be in Europe during this time, but behind the ocean.
Safe across the ocean in Los Alamos, the bomb project continued to gain momentum despite Germany's defeat.
After the victory in Europe, after May 8th, we all went out and celebrated for a day. But the next day, right back, working away, because we all wanted to know whether it could be done. And we didn't think, you know, is this trip necessary? We just went right on.
We were almost at the end of our work. We worked for 3 years, almost day and night. You cannot stop. You wouldn't stop. Apart from the fact that we thought, correctly, that this bomb will end a very, very bloody war against the Japanese.
In the Pacific, in mortal combat against a fanatic foe, the Army, the Marines, and the Navy were driving to a finish fight. But the Kamikaze Corps, the Japanese pilots who rode the divine wind to certain suicide and possible devastation of our ships, were taking a heavy toll.
The Japanese fought with a suicidal fury that the Allies could scarcely believe. Now the atomic bomb took on new significance. It might shock the Japanese into surrender. Its use seemed like a logical extension of strategic bombing.
I think we did not understand the full novelty of our weapon. We thought of it more as continuous still with the old way, because after all, the bombers were destroying a city a day, so to speak, in Japan. They made about 100 raids. And for us, it was just 1 or 2 or 3 more. Yes, they were much cheaper. They were even more terrible, but not by a big factor.
I know I felt that the shock would be the thing that might convince the Japanese that they had lost. They already had. They were licked. But that was not the temperament of the Japanese to quit when you're licked. In other words, you fight to the finish. That had been demonstrated throughout the Japanese War.
One suggestion was that the Japanese be invited and members of the United Nations be invited to a demonstration in some deserted island in the Pacific. The consensus on that was it would not really be as shocking as you'd want, so to speak.
On the British side, I think there was less discussion of these various alternatives. I think the Prime Minister was quite satisfied and indeed convinced that if this weapon could be developed, it should be used. One must not forget that at the time that the bomb was dropped and the war stopped, the British were poised to invade Malaysia, and the Americans and British and the Allies were poised to invade Japan. And it was calculated at that time that on the American Allied side alone, in the Japanese operation, there might be 1 million casualties.
In July, Truman sailed for a conference in Potsdam, Germany, as the newest member of the Big Three. The talks would coincide with the long-awaited testing of the atomic bomb in the Alamogordo Desert in New Mexico. The physicists in New Mexico were confident the bomb would work. The 5-foot sphere was the culmination of 3 years and $2 billion worth of effort. They wagered on its actual power and hoped they were right in judging that the gadget, as they called it, would not cause the Earth's atmosphere to catch fire. Aboard ship, the talk was of an invasion of Japan scheduled to begin in the fall. Troops began to move from Europe to the Pacific. But if the bomb worked, the United States would hold a powerful new hand. Invasion of the Japanese homeland might be avoided. The Soviet Union, once urged to join the Pacific fight, might not gain a foothold in the Far East. And Truman, the newcomer, could negotiate post-war settlements with Stalin from a position of newfound strength. The nuclear age dawned in the early morning hours of July 16th, 1945.
I was at 10 miles away, base camp, and I'll never forget the sense of heat on the face, as though the noonday sun had appeared across the cold desert morning. To me, that was much more important than the flash or even the rumbling, thunderous sound that came and echoed among the mountains a minute later. The real point was that sense of direct, intimate contact through the warming of the skin. But of course, we were all awed and silenced by the extraordinary power of this thing which we had understood in the numbers, but not in true experience.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
In many of the scientists, the successful test stirred a sense of awe and foreboding. The news from New Mexico came as a great relief to Truman and Churchill, meeting at Potsdam. They were concerned that the Red Army's occupation of Eastern Europe would give Stalin leverage in bargaining for post-war influence. Now, the West had its own secret leverage. From the moment of the test, the bomb had assumed a towering influence that it has never lost. At the end of the formal conference session on July 24th, Truman hinted to Stalin of the bomb's imminent use. He said, "We have a new weapon of unusual destructive force." Stalin merely replied he hoped it would be put to good use against the Japanese. Neither man ventured to pursue the discussion, although the Soviet leader knew full well that Truman was referring to the atomic bomb, as Stalin's interpreter, Valentin Berezhkov, recalls.
Secretary Stimson and Churchill were watching Stalin's reaction, but Stalin didn't show on his face anything. So they got an idea that he didn't understand what it was about. But Zhukov says that when Stalin, after that, went to his quarters, and there was Molotov and Zhukov, and Stalin said we should call immediately Kurchatov to accelerate our program.
10,000 miles from Potsdam, 12 airmen waited in the early morning darkness as their B-29 was loaded. Captain Paul Tibbets had named the plane the Enola Gay, after his mother. His cargo, an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy. The takeoff was tense. The plane needed the full length of the runway to get off the ground with its 5-ton weapon.
Before the atomic explosion, the air raid siren had already blown an all clear. But why was one B-29 flying through the sky?
It was 8:15 on the morning of August 6th when the B-29 dropped its bomb. 1,800 feet above Hiroshima, Japan, two subcritical masses of uranium-235 were explosively joined in the presence of free neutrons. The energy released was 2,000 times greater than the largest explosive ever used in war. The city below burned at 3,000 degrees. 70,000 people died instantly.
Everything grew pitch black in a moment, and I couldn't even see right in front of my eyes. In about 10 minutes, the smoke began to clear, and I could see the schoolyard. And I thought that I could begin to understand what had happened. But I myself had been thrown back about 10 meters by the rush of wind. My friends behind me, or to the right or left, all had been knocked down by the wind, and all had fallen all around the schoolyard. The school building was constructed of wood, so it had collapsed. The houses in the neighborhood around the school had totally disappeared. When we looked in the distance, only the Western-style buildings remained. The town of Hiroshima was gone completely.
We circled finally low over Hiroshima and stared in disbelief. There below was the flat, level ground of what had been a city, scorched red and telltale scar. But no hundreds of planes had visited this town during a long night. One bomber and one bomb had, in the time it takes a rifle bullet to cross the city, turned a city of 300,000 into a burning pyre. That was the new thing.
Well, my first reaction to Hiroshima was that was a feeling of pride. This would probably end the war, which we all wanted very, very much. And pride because we had been instrumental in bringing this about. My second reaction came when we saw films which had been taken by an observation plane which flew over Hiroshima a few hours later, and which photographed the terrible destruction of the city. We had calculated beforehand how much destruction there would be, but seeing it on the film, seeing it more or less directly, was so much more terrible.
very short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
The reign of ruin continued, first with conventional bombing, and then on August 9th, a second atomic weapon was dropped on Nagasaki.
Our impression is difficult to describe. In some ways, especially when after a few days it was clear that the war was over. In some ways we said, well, we did it. The war is over. The killing of Japanese and Americans has ended, and it's we who did it. And that gave us a great deal of satisfaction. At the same time, we were thinking of these other problems, of Niels Bohr's ideas, at least most of us, some of us, and that showed that actually our work starts. Now we have really to tell the public the real significance of this tremendous weapon.
The Japanese soon surrendered. To Truman and the Western Allies, the bomb had been their savior, and the ceremony in Tokyo Bay was a signal for celebration. But the American success with the bomb had a very different significance for many Soviet leaders. They had fought a devastating battle with the Nazis, and they had won. They had pushed Hitler's armies out of Russia and back at great cost all the way to Germany. Their troops had liberated and now controlled much of Eastern Europe. They had been victorious, and they expected to sit as equals at the victor's table. Now their efforts seemed as good as wasted. They saw the atomic bomb not as a godsend, but as a threat.
At that time, of course, we understood that the main purpose of the nuclear bombardment of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not against the Japanese or even to end the Second World War, but to show the Soviet Union how strong became the United States.
The newly won peace was strewn with uncertainty. To the cheering crowds in Times Square, the atomic bomb had brought an end to war and the belief that the U.S., with its awesome new weapon, would be the most powerful nation on Earth. But at the dawn of the nuclear age, poet James Agee wrote, "Victory was already only the shout of a child in the street." The world had changed. A new age had begun. And slowly, we tried to understand what it all meant.
Sir, we have an unknown, Zulu 445.
50 years into the nuclear age, we have a lot of weapons and very few answers.